Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
If you're new here, we'll hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on future episodes.
We've got a really important one today.
Absolutely, and one that's particularly relevant if you're prepping for those UPSC exams.
You got it. We're diving deep into communalism in India.
It's a topic that's often, kind of shrouded in misunderstanding and oversimplification.
We're going to try to unpack that.
Yeah, so we've got a ton of fascinating sources to help us out with
There's
this.
a lot to cover.
Yeah, academic texts, historical accounts, even some recent news reports.
It's going to help us paint a clearer picture.
Exactly. So let's get right into it. First things first, what exactly do we mean when we talk about communalism in India?
Well, it's not just about people belonging to different communities or having strong community ties.
Okay.
It's more about how religion is used to create a sense of division.
Okay, so it's taking those differences and kind of turning them into a weapon.
Yeah, you could say that it can lead to tension and prejudice, and in some cases even violence.
So it's not just about different faiths existing side by side. It's about those differences being used to create conflict.
Exactly.
Now, our sources talk about this communal ideology evolving in stages.
Right.
Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. So in the initial stage, people might simply believe that those who share their religion also share other common interests, like, economic or social or political interests.
Right, so like a very basic level of assuming everyone who, goes to your church also likes the same music or something.
Yeah, something like that, but obviously a bit of an oversimplification.
Sure.
But then things can escalate. In the second stage, people start seeing these interests as not just different, but completely opposed across religious lines.
So it goes from we have some things in common to we're completely different.
And even further to we're actually against each other.
So that us versus them mentality starts to really take root.
Unfortunately, yes. And that's when it becomes dangerous. The final stage is when those differences are seen as completely incompatible, even hostile.
Okay, so that's where the prejudice, the discrimination, and even violence can stem from.
Exactly.
So then the question becomes, what pushes people down this path? What are the root causes of this kind of communal thinking?
Our sources point to a bunch of different factors: historical, political, economic, social. Even the role of media plays a part.
Right, it's like this complex web of influences.
It really is.
And it's interesting because one source I was looking at talks about how British historians often presented ancient India as this period of Hindu rule followed by a medieval period of Muslim dominance.
Right.
And they kind of framed it as Hindus facing oppression during that time. So it's like they created a historical narrative that already had these seeds of division planted within it.
Yes, and those narratives, unfortunately, can have a very long-lasting impact.
They really do. And of course, we can't forget about the whole divide and rule policy the British employed.
Oh, absolutely. That was a key factor in exacerbating religious tensions.
Yeah, classic strategy, turning people against each other so they don't unite against the real power.
Exactly. And a prime example of that is the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims.
Right, so basically people voting for representatives from their own religious community rather than looking at the bigger picture.
And that system later extended to Sikhs and Anglo-Indians, too.
So it's like they were deliberately creating these voting blocks based on religion instead of encouraging people to find common ground.
Which unfortunately has had a long-lasting effect on Indian politics.
It really has, because even today we see some political parties still exploiting religious sentiments for votes.
It's a tactic that continues to keep those old wounds from healing.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole economic angle.
Right.
One source was really highlighting how economic disparities and competition for resources can fuel a lot of this communal tension.
Absolutely. When people are struggling to survive and they see another community seemingly doing better, it's easy for resentment and frustration to build.
Right, and it creates this breeding ground for those feelings to be manipulated along communal lines.
Exactly. A good example is the demand for a separate Pakistan.
Right.
That movement gained traction partly due to the perceived socioeconomic inequalities between Hindus and Muslims at the time.
So it wasn't just about religious identity. It was also about economic and social anxieties.
Exactly.
And there's also the Mappila Rebellion in Kerala.
That's another interesting case.
It's often portrayed as a purely religious clash, but the sources I was looking at suggested that it was rooted in economic grievances.
Right. The Mappila Muslims, who were mainly peasants, were facing exploitation from Hindu landlords.
So again, religion might have been a rallying cry, but the underlying issue was this economic disparity.
Exactly. And that nuance is often missed.
It's a good reminder to kind of dig deeper and look beyond those surface-level explanations.
Definitely.
And of course, we can't ignore the social factors that contribute to this issue.
Right, things like beef consumption, language, imposition, religious conversions, these can all become flashpoints.
Absolutely. These differences in customs and practices, when they're combined with existing prejudices, can quickly escalate into conflict.
Like each difference becomes a threat instead of just a point of interest.
And sadly, the media often plays a role in amplifying those differences and anxieties.
Sensationalism sells, and communal violence unfortunately makes for sensational headlines.
It does.
The spread of rumors through traditional and social media can really inflame tensions and turn small incidents into large-scale outbreaks of violence.
It's like pouring fuel on a fire.
Exactly.
There was also this interesting discussion in one of the sources about films that depict communal riots,
Right.
like Bombay or Black Friday.
Yes, films that aim to raise awareness about the issue.
But there's also this argument that they could potentially reinforce existing prejudices and stereotypes, even if their intention is good.
It's a delicate balance for sure. We need responsible media that promotes understanding, not just sensationalizes violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork here. We've got a better understanding of what communalism is and the complex web of factors that contribute to it.
Right.
Now, to really get a grasp on this issue, I think we need to take a bit of a journey through time and see how it's manifested throughout Indian history.
I agree. Let's dive into that.
Now, what's fascinating is that ancient India, contrary to some of those colonial narratives we talked about earlier, was actually a period of pretty remarkable religious harmony.
It's true.
Ashoka, for example, promoted Dhamma,
Right.
this universal code of conduct that emphasized tolerance and nonviolence.
Very different from that clash of civilizations narrative.
Exactly. It's like this reminder that India has a long and rich history of pluralism that often gets overshadowed.
I think that's a very important point.
It is. But then as we move into the medieval period, things become a little more complex.
Yeah, we see rulers like Akbar who really embodied this idea of secularism,
Right.
abolishing the jizya tax on non-Muslims, and even trying to create a new syncretic religion, Din-i-Ilahi, which incorporated elements of different faiths.
He sounds like he was way ahead of his time.
He really was a visionary leader in terms of religious tolerance.
But then on the other hand, you have rulers like Aurangzeb, whose policies were much more intolerant.
That's true. He reimposed the jizya tax, destroyed temples, and engaged in forced conversions.
So even within the same historical period, we see these very different approaches to religious diversity.
Yes, and I think it's important to remember that these were largely conflicts among the elite. The vast majority of people living in rural areas were probably more concerned with their daily lives and local issues.
So that narrative of constant Hindu-Muslim conflict throughout history needs a bit of a reality check.
I would say so, yes.
Okay, so then we get to the pre-independence period and things start to shift pretty dramatically.
Yeah.
This is where we see the rise of communalism kind of getting intertwined with the rise of nationalism.
It's like these two powerful forces, both aiming to shape the future of India, start pulling in different directions.
Exactly. We see movements like the Shuddhi movement emerge, which aim to reconvert Hindus who had converted to other faiths.
And figures like Syed Ahmed Khan, who initially emphasized Hindu-Muslim unity, start advocating for separate Muslim representation.
Right, believing that Muslim interests wouldn't be protected in a Hindu-majority independent India.
And this is really where the seeds of the two-nation theory are sown, the idea that Hindus and Muslims constitute two separate nations.
Which ultimately leads to the demand for Pakistan.
Yes, and unfortunately, British policies of the period, like the partition of Bengal and the Morley Minto reforms, only added fuel to the fire.
They were masters at exploiting those divisions.
They were.
So as we move into the 20th century, communalism takes on this more aggressive and extremist form.
Right.
The Muslim League under Jinnah hardens its stance, demanding a separate Muslim nation. And on the Hindu side, organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS emerge, promoting a more exclusivist Hindu nationalist ideology.
And communalism truly transforms into a mass movement fueled by this divisive rhetoric and a growing sense of insecurity on both sides.
A really tragic turn of events with devastating consequences.
Absolutely culminating in the horrors of partition.
The Partition of 1947. A stark reminder of the human cost of communal hatred. Millions displaced, countless lives lost, and the wounds of that division still lingering today.
It's a dark chapter in our history that continues to shape the relationship between India and Pakistan.
It really does.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, even after independence, the ghost of communalism didn't disappear.
No, it didn't.
India continued and continues to grapple with this challenge. But before we dive into that, I think we need to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll explore the dark chapters of post-independence communal violence and how this issue is still manifesting in contemporary India.
Sounds good.
And we're back continuing our deep dive into communalism in India.
Before we jump into post-independence India, I think it's really important to just acknowledge the weight of this topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, communalism isn't just some abstract concept.
Right.
It's a lived reality for so many people, and the consequences are very real.
Exactly. And as we talk about these specific events, it's crucial to remember that behind every headline, every statistic, there are real human stories of suffering and loss.
And resilience, too.
Absolutely. So as we navigate these sensitive issues, let's do it with empathy and a commitment to understanding that human cost.
I agree.
Now, our sources point to several instances where this dark side of India has emerged, even after independence.
The anti-Sikh riots of 1984 are a really chilling example.
Yeah, after the assassination of Indira Gandhi.
Right, thousands of Sikhs were targeted and killed in just this brutal outburst of violence.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of that tragedy and the trauma inflicted on the Sikh community.
And what's even more disturbing is that justice for many of the victims remains elusive.
Yeah, even decades later.
That lack of accountability can really fuel resentment and make it even harder to heal those wounds.
Absolutely. And then there's the tragedy of the Kashmiri Pandits.
Kashmir, once known for its unique syncretic culture, Kashmiriyat.
Right. Hindus, Muslims, and other communities coexisting peacefully.
Exactly. But in the late 1980s, it became a hotbed of conflict.
With the rise of militancy and terrorism.
Right. And all of that, coupled with communal tensions, led to the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits from their ancestral homeland.
Such a heart-wrenching example of how communal violence can just shatter the fabric of a society.
It displaces entire communities and leaves these deep scars.
It does. And these incidents aren't isolated. The demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992
Another major turning point.
triggered those widespread communal riots across the country,
It showed how these historical disputes can be manipulated to incite violence.
and how those seemingly distant historical events can have very real consequences in the present.
Exactly.
And sadly, the list goes on. The Godhra train burning in 2002.
Followed by that horrific retaliatory violence in Gujarat.
It left a deep scar on the nation.
The scale of the death and destruction was just immense.
It was...
And then, more recently, the Assam violence in 2012, the Muzaffarnagar riots in 2013.
Right.
All grim reminders that the threat of communalism is persistent.
And how quickly those simmering tensions can erupt.
Exactly.
It's clear that post-independence India hasn't been immune to this challenge. But what about contemporary India? How is communalism manifesting today?
Well, while those large-scale riots might be less frequent now, communalism has taken on new and more insidious forms.
Okay.
It often simmers beneath the surface and erupts in unexpected ways.
Like that Hadiyah case in 2017?
Oh, yes, that one really captured national attention.
You got tangled up in that whole love jihad narrative.
It did. This case involved a Hindu woman who converted to Islam and married a Muslim man.
Right.
And it sparked this huge debate about religious freedom, individual choice, and allegations of forced conversions.
It showed how personal decisions, especially those involving interfaith relationships, can become these battlegrounds for communal tensions.
Absolutely. And then there's the ongoing issue of beef consumption.
Still a major flashpoint.
It is. And it's disturbing to see how something as basic as food choice can be used to target and demonize entire communities.
The data is pretty stark, too. Muslims have been disproportionately targeted in violence related to this.
It points to those deep-seated prejudices that still exist.
But it's not just the violence. It's also those subtle ways communalism seeps into our social fabric,
Right.
like those Garwapsi programs.
The reconversion campaigns aimed at bringing people back to Hinduism.
While proponents claim they're voluntary and goals, there have been a lot of allegations of coercion and financial incentives.
It raises concerns about religious freedom and the right to choose your own faith,
It's like these attempts to homogenize India's diverse religious landscape.
which could create an environment of fear for minority communities.
And then there's the growing concern about religious radicalization, particularly among young people.
The digital age presents new challenges in that regard.
Yeah, with the rapid spread of information and misinformation.
Extremist ideologies can now spread so easily through social media.
And potentially influence vulnerable individuals.
Right. And while the influence of groups like ISIS might be limited in India, it's still a worrying trend.
Especially because that online radicalization can lead to real-world consequences.
Exactly, like we saw with the Delhi riots in 2020.
Sparked by tensions over the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens.
Those riots resulted in widespread violence and loss of life.
It highlighted how political decisions can have these unintended consequences and further inflame communal fault lines.
And create a climate of fear and distrust.
It's a reminder that even in a democracy like India, the potential for communal violence is still a very real threat.
It is.
And addressing this challenge requires constant vigilance and a commitment to protecting the rights of all citizens regardless of their faith.
I think it's also about recognizing that communalism doesn't exist in isolation.
Right.
It's often intertwined with other forms of marginalization, whether it's economic, social, or political.
So it's not just about addressing religious differences. It's about creating a society that's truly just and equitable for everyone.
Exactly.
But how do we get there? Are there effective strategies for mitigating communalism and building a more harmonious India? That's what we'll explore in our next segment. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into communalism in India. It's been a pretty heavy conversation,
It has.
but I always like to end on a hopeful note.
Me too.
And I think, understanding a problem is the first step to solving it.
I completely agree. And luckily, our sources don't just, diagnose the problem.
Right.
They offer a range of potential solutions too, strategies to mitigate communalism and, build a more harmonious future for India.
Okay, so let's shift gears from the what is to the what can be done.
Sounds good.
What are some of the key takeaways in terms of solutions?
Well, first of all, it's clear that there's no quick fix.
Right.
Addressing communalism requires this multi-pronged approach.
Like tackling it at the political level, the social level, economic, even individual levels.
Right. Exactly. It's about strengthening the social fabric from multiple angles.
Okay, so let's start with the political sphere. What can be done to prevent the exploitation of religious sentiments for political gain?
Well, for one, political parties need to commit to a code of conduct that rejects divisive rhetoric and communal appeals.
Right, so no more using religion as a tool to win votes.
Exactly. The Supreme Court has actually issued directives against this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there's a legal framework to build upon.
So it's about choosing statesmanship over those short-term electoral gains.
I think so.
But beyond directives, what about actual mechanisms to prevent communal violence?
Our sources highlight the importance of identifying and monitoring areas that are prone to violence, especially during religious festivals.
Right.
And using technology like drones can be really helpful in that regard.
So proactive policing and tech tools working together.
Exactly.
But prevention is only one part of the puzzle, right? What about addressing those root causes, those simmering tensions that can lead to these outbreaks?
That's where social measures come in. Religious leaders and community elders have a huge responsibility to promote peace and understanding.
It's about using their influence to bridge those divides.
Absolutely.
And education seems like a crucial piece of that.
Definitely. We need to instill values of tolerance and respect for diversity from a young age.
Start early.
Yeah. Schools and colleges can play a vital role in shaping a more inclusive society.
It's about empowering the next generation to be agents of change.
Exactly.
But let's not forget about the economic dimension.
Right. We talked about how poverty and inequality can be breeding grounds for resentment.
So addressing those economic disparities is crucial.
Absolutely. Policies that promote inclusive growth, create jobs, and ensure equitable access to resources are essential.
Right. So it's about creating a society where everyone has a fair shot, regardless of their background or their beliefs.
That is the goal.
Okay, so beyond these kind of broad measures, what are some specific actions that can be taken to strengthen communal harmony?
Well, our sources had a few interesting suggestions. Promoting interfaith dialogue, for one.
All right.
Organizing events where people from different communities can interact and learn about each other's cultures.
So creating spaces for positive interaction.
Exactly. And there's a big emphasis on value-based education, too.
So not just teaching facts and figures, but really instilling those values of peace and nonviolence and secularism.
Right.
But what about those challenges posed by the digital age, the spread of misinformation and online radicalization?
That's a tough one. Swift police action against those spreading hate speech online is definitely necessary.
Right.
But it's not just about punishment, it's also about rehabilitation. Counseling and de-radicalization programs can help.
So a combination of legal deterrence and addressing those underlying causes.
Exactly.
And what about justice for victims of communal violence? We talked about how impunity can create a vicious cycle.
Yeah, that's where judicial reforms are so important. Ensuring speedy trials and providing adequate compensation for victims.
So showing that the system is committed to protecting all citizens.
and upholding the rule of law.
Our sources also highlighted the need to empower marginalized communities,
Right.
especially those who have been historically disadvantaged.
The Sachar Committee report recommended setting up an Equal Opportunities Commission to address discrimination.
That sounds like a great initiative.
It's about leveling the playing field and making sure everyone has equal opportunities.
Absolutely. And I know some states are also exploring stricter measures to combat mob violence.
Yeah, Manipur actually passed a law against lynching.
Hopefully more states will follow suit.
I think so. It sends a strong message that mob justice won't be tolerated
Right. It's about reaffirming the rule of law.
and ensuring that everyone feels safe.
And finally, we can't forget about the media.
The media plays such a crucial role.
It really does. In a world that's so saturated with information responsible, journalism is more important than ever.
Yeah, journalism that challenges stereotypes, promotes understanding, and celebrates India's diversity.
The media has the power to shape public perception.
And foster a climate of tolerance.
So it's about using that power responsibly.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like it's a collective effort involving political change, will social change, economic empowerment,
Yeah.
individual responsibility, all amplified by the media.
It's a complex challenge for sure,
It is.
but I don't think it's insurmountable.
I agree. India has overcome a lot of obstacles in its history.
And I believe we can overcome this one too.
Well, I think our deep dive has shown that while the path ahead might be challenging, it's also illuminated by that hope for a more harmonious and inclusive India.
I agree.
And that hope is fueled by all those individuals and organizations working to bridge divides.
They're the real heroes.
They are. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
It flew by.
It did. We hope you found this exploration insightful and maybe even a little bit empowering.
I hope so.
Remember, understanding is the first step towards action, and we all have a role to play in shaping a better future.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.